Has anyone ever accused you of being too emotional just to dismiss your pain?
Picture this moment frozen in time, the one that shattered the fragile illusion of family harmony I had clung to for years, standing in the middle of my own living room during what was supposed to be a modest celebration of my 40th birthday. Surrounded by the faint scent of vanilla candles and the awkward chatter of relatives who had shown up more out of obligation than genuine warmth, only to witness my niece Taylor, that 16-year-old firecracker with her perfectly highlighted hair and an attitude honed by too many unchecked privileges, deliberately hurl her bright red cherry cola across the front of my carefully chosen silk dress, the liquid splashing in a dramatic arc that soaked through the fabric almost instantly and left dark, sticky trails running down to the hem, her eyes narrowing with that smug satisfaction as she delivered her cutting line right to my face, declaring without a shred of remorse that now I finally looked as cheap as I acted, a statement that hung in the air like a challenge, drawing immediate laughter from my own mother, who sat perched on the edge of the couch with her glass of cheap boxed wine in hand, her chuckles echoing off the walls as she nodded approvingly at Taylor's boldness and turned to my sister Sarah with a conspiratorial wink, siding instantly with her granddaughter in a way that twisted the knife deeper into the already raw wound of familial betrayal, while I stood there motionless for what felt like an eternity, the cold wetness seeping into my skin, but doing nothing to cool the slow-building fire of indignation rising in my chest, choosing in that instant not to explode or retreat into tears, but instead to curve my lips into a serene, almost enigmatic smile that masked the calculated thoughts already swirling in my mind, because they had no clue about the invisible threads of control I had woven over the years to keep this dysfunctional unit from completely imploding, and in that smile, I silently vowed that this would be the turning point where I began to pull those threads just tight enough to make them feel the tension. The evening unfolded in a haze of forced civility after that explosive incident, with relatives milling about the snack table, exchanging uncomfortable glances and murmuring platitudes about how kids will be kids. Even though Taylor was far from a little child and her actions carried the weight of deliberate cruelty born from the entitlement Sarah had nurtured in her since the divorce that left our family splintered a decade ago. While I moved through the cleanup motions with mechanical efficiency, wiping down surfaces and stacking plates in the kitchen where the fluorescent light cast harsh shadows on my stained dress, refusing to change out of it as a quiet act of defiance that no one else seemed to notice amid their own distractions. Sarah, my younger sister by 5 years and the perpetual favorite in Mom's eyes, had arrived late as always, sweeping in with Taylor in tow and barely acknowledging the effort I had put into organizing the gathering at my comfortable but unpretentious suburban home in the quiet outskirts of Ohio, a place I had earned through years of steady work as a financial advisor who specialized in helping people untangle the messes of their own making, ironically enough. Since I had become the unofficial fixer for so many of Sarah's financial disasters over the years, co-signing loans and covering overdrafts when her impulsive shopping sprees and half-baked business ideas left her teetering on the edge of bankruptcy, all while she and Mom whispered behind my back about how my frugal lifestyle made me seem stingy or out of touch with what really mattered in life, like the flashy vacations and designer labels that symbolized success in their world, but only ever led to more debt in mine. As the last guests trickled out around 10 o'clock, leaving behind the faint echoes of small talk and the lingering aroma of cooling cake, I finally retreated to my home office upstairs, the door clicking shut behind me with a sense of finality that matched the resolve settling in my gut, and there, under the soft glow of my desk lamp, I powered up my laptop and navigated to the secure banking portal where the details of Sarah's credit cards waited like dormant weapons, accounts that bore my name as the primary holder because she had begged for my help during her lowest point after the divorce, promising to make it right, but instead treating the limitless lines as an endless well to draw from for Taylor's whims and her own fleeting indulgences. So with steady fingers and a heart that pounded not with malice, but with the justice of long overdue boundaries, I initiated the cancellation process on every single card, watching as the system processed each request with clinical precision and locked them down irrevocably, the notifications pinging silently into the void since I had ensured they went only to my email first. A small but satisfying act of reclamation that felt like shedding an ill-fitting skin I had worn for far too long. And as I leaned back in my chair with a cup of chamomile tea steaming beside me, the humor of it all began to creep in, imagining Sarah's face the next day when her morning latte purchase was declined at the drive-thru, or Taylor's shock upon realizing her online shopping cart of trendy outfits had vanished into digital limbo, a petty thrill that lightened the weight of the evening's humiliation without erasing the deeper hurt of Mom's laughter still ringing in my ears. Sleep came fitfully that night, my mind replaying the party's chaos in fragmented dreams, but I rose early the next morning around 6. The autumn sunlight filtering through the blinds as I brewed coffee and settled into the quiet routine of checking emails and news feeds on my phone, half-braced for the inevitable fallout that I knew would come with the dawn, and sure enough, by 7:45. The first frantic call lit up my screen from Sarah, which I allowed to roll over to voicemail out of curiosity to gauge the level of panic in her recorded pleas, followed shortly by a barrage of texts from Taylor that escalated from confusion to outright demands. Her messages flooding in with a sense of entitlement that made me shake my head in wry amusement at how quickly the tables had turned. Then, precisely at 7:50, another alert buzzed through, Taylor's voice note this time, breathless and edged with hysteria as she described rushing outside in her pajamas to find her prized SUV. The one Sarah had surprised her with on her 16th birthday, financed through yet another loan I had reluctantly backed, completely absent from the driveway, replaced only by an empty space and a vague sense of violation. Her words tumbling out about calling the police and how Mom was already yelling about some towing mix-up, leaving me to stare at my phone with that same composed smile from the night before, wondering just how the ripples of my initial move would spread and what unexpected undercurrents might surface next in this unraveling family tapestry that I had finally decided to tug at with purpose. The morning after the birthday debacle unfolded with a predictability that bordered on comedic if it weren't for the undercurrent of real tension rippling through my phone like aftershocks from an earthquake I had subtly triggered. As I sat at my kitchen table nursing a second cup of strong black coffee around 8:15, the steam curling up in lazy spirals while I replayed Taylor's frantic voice note in my mind, her description of the empty driveway and the dawning horror on her face as she pieced together that her beloved SUV, that shiny symbol of premature adulthood Sarah had financed with such fanfare just months ago, had been whisked away in the dead of night by a repossession team acting on overdue payments that had piled up faster than snowdrifts in an Ohio winter, a situation I had nudged along the evening before with an anonymous tip to the lender's hotline, providing just enough verifiable details from the loan documents I still had access to as cosigner without leaving a direct trail back to me, because after years of watching Sarah juggle bills like a circus act on the verge of collapse, it felt almost merciful to accelerate the inevitable rather than let it fester into a bigger mess that might drag me down with it. Sarah's voicemails piled up next, her initial confusion giving way to a sharper edge of accusation in each successive message, her voice hoarse from what sounded like early morning yelling matches with Taylor over the shared devastation of losing their wheels. And I could picture the scene at their cluttered two-story house just 20 minutes down the interstate, the one with the peeling siding and the overgrown lawn that spoke volumes about priorities skewed toward appearances over maintenance as mother and daughter scrambled for alternatives like calling in favors from neighbors or debating the merits of public buses that would cramp their style in ways Taylor's social circle would never let her live down. By 9 o'clock, the confrontation arrived uninvited but not entirely unexpected, with Sarah's car her backup sedan that she kept for emergencies, the one paid off through my occasional infusions of cash, pulling up outside my driveway just as I was rinsing my mug in the sink, her silhouette visible through the window as she stormed toward the front door with Taylor slouching a few steps behind, her arms crossed in that defiant teenage posture that screamed volumes about whose side she was on without uttering a word, and when I opened the door to let them in, the air between us crackled with the kind of electricity that precedes a summer storm. Sarah's eyes red-rimmed and accusatory as she launched into a tirade about the credit cards being mysteriously frozen overnight. Her attempts to use them for gas and groceries rebuffed at every turn with error messages that left her fuming at the checkout lines, while Taylor hovered in the entryway, kicking at the doormat with her sneaker and muttering under her breath about how this was all payback for the party stunt, her words laced with that petulant certainty that adults were just obstacles to her entitlement. We migrated to the living room where the remnants of last night's gathering still lingered in the form of a forgotten party hat on the coffee table, and there, amid the neutral tones of my carefully curated space that reflected my preference for simplicity over excess, Sarah demanded explanations with a fervor that bordered on desperation. Her hands gesturing wildly as she recounted the repo notice they had found taped to the garage upon closer inspection, detailing the missed installments on the SUV loan that I had co-signed during one of her brighter moments of optimism about her freelance graphic design gigs covering the costs, a favor she now framed as an overreach on my part rather than the lifeline it had been when her ex-husband skipped town with half their savings. As the argument heated up, with Sarah pacing the rug and Taylor flopping onto the couch like she owned the place, I maintained my composure by leaning against the arm of the chair and explaining the situation in measured tones, pointing out how the credit cancellations were a necessary step to protect all parties involved from further debt spirals, especially since the accounts were still linked to my credit score, and I couldn't afford to let her habits torpedo the financial stability I had built brick by painstaking brick through late nights at the office and skipping the luxuries she chased so recklessly, and in that moment of raw honesty, a minor family secret slipped out almost accidentally when Taylor pressed me on why I even had access to their finances in the first place, prompting me to reveal that it stemmed from the time Sarah had nearly lost custody during a rough patch post-divorce, when I had stepped in not just with money, but with legal fees to stabilize things. A detail Sarah had glossed over in her retellings to make herself the sole victim, her face flushing with a mix of shame and irritation at the reminder of how deep my involvement ran. The humor emerged unexpectedly then, as Taylor, in her frustration, grabbed my landline to call a friend for a ride home only to misdial and connect with an old telemarketer recording that blared a cheerful pitch for debt relief services right in the middle of our standoff. The irony so thick it drew a reluctant snort from Sarah despite herself, lightening the atmosphere just enough to allow me to pivot to my next witty countermeasure, casually informing them over a pot of fresh coffee that I would be pausing the monthly stipend I sent to Mom's account, the one covering her utilities and occasional outings, until Sarah sorted out her own obligations, framing it as a temporary adjustment rather than a punishment, though the way her eyes widened told me it landed with the intended sting, a clever redirection that shifted some of the burden back where it belonged without escalating to outright war. The visit wrapped up around noon with them departing in subdued silence, Sarah's backup car sputtering away as I waved from the porch, but the sense of uncertainty lingered like a fog rolling in off Lake Erie, making me question for the first time if these calculated jabs were truly evening the score or just stirring up more resentment that could boomerang in ways I hadn't anticipated. And as the afternoon wore on with work emails demanding my focus back at the home office, my phone remained suspiciously quiet until around 9 that evening when Mom's call came through, her voice thin and labored over the line as she described collapsing in her kitchen after hearing the full extent of the morning's chaos from Sarah. An ambulance dispatched and en route to the emergency room where doctors suspected a stress-induced episode tied to her ongoing heart issues, her parting words laced with blame directed squarely at me for pushing her daughter to the brink and unraveling the fragile peace we had all pretended to maintain, leaving me to grab my keys and head out into the darkening streets with a knot of worry twisting in my stomach, wondering if this latest development was a genuine health crisis or yet another layer in the family's intricate game of emotional leverage. And as the hospital lights loomed ahead in the distance, I couldn't help but brace for whatever revelations the night might force to the surface next. The drive to the hospital that night felt like navigating through a thickening fog of doubt and unresolved anger, the streetlights blurring into streaks as I gripped the steering wheel tighter with each passing mile. my mind racing ahead to the sterile corridors and the inevitable confrontation waiting there amid the beeps of monitors and the hushed voices of nurses, all triggered by Mom's sudden collapse that she had pinned squarely on my shoulders over the phone, her labored breaths conveying a mix of genuine frailty and the familiar undercurrent of manipulation that had defined our interactions since I was old enough to recognize the patterns in her favoritism towards Sarah. By the time I pulled into the emergency room lot just past 10, the autumn chill had seeped into the air, carrying with it the faint scent of rain on pavement that matched the heaviness settling over me. And as I hurried through the automatic doors into the waiting area that reeked of stale coffee and industrial cleaner, I spotted Sarah and Taylor immediately, clustered near the vending machine with disposable cups in hand, their faces etched with exhaustion under the unforgiving fluorescent bulbs that cast long shadows and amplified every line of worry on Sarah's features, while Taylor slouched against the wall, her earbuds dangling like a shield against the discomfort of it all. A far cry from the bold instigator she had been just 24 hours earlier at my birthday gathering. We exchanged terse greetings that carried more subtext than warmth, Sarah filling me in on the details with a voice strained from hours of vigilance, explaining how Mom had been rushed in after a neighbor found her slumped by the stove. The doctors attributing it to a severe anxiety attack compounded by her hypertension medication and the stress of the day's upheavals, recommending overnight observation to rule out anything more sinister like a mild cardiac event, which left us all suspended in this limbo of plastic chairs and outdated magazines, the kind of place that forces families to confront the cracks in their foundations when distractions are stripped away. As the night wore on, with coffee refills becoming our only ritual to stave off the tedium, the conversation inevitably drifted into deeper resentments that had simmered unspoken for years, Sarah recounting how Mom had always seen me as the distant one, the daughter who escaped the chaos of our Cleveland upbringing by burying herself in books and jobs rather than embracing the messiness of relationships like she did, even if those choices often led to bailouts that I provided without fanfare. While I countered gently but firmly that my independence wasn't a rejection, but a survival mechanism forged from watching her cycle through bad decisions without ever learning from them, a dynamic that Taylor interrupted with a surprising vulnerability, admitting in a rare moment of candor that the online posts she had made, mocking my cheap habits, stemmed from her own insecurities about fitting in at school where status symbols like cars and clothes defined worth. A twist that surfaced when Sarah checked her phone and saw notifications from Taylor's friends teasing her about the repo incident, prompting Taylor to defensively pull up her Instagram history right there in the waiting room, the screenshots revealing a string of subtle but cutting jabs at me over the past months, everything from memes about thrift store fashion to captions implying I was jealous of their lifestyle, each one landing like a fresh splash of that cherry cola from the party. The revelation hung between us like a charged wire, Taylor's cheeks flushing with a mix of defiance and regret as she snapped her phone shut and crossed her arms, but instead of lashing out, I felt a surge of that wry humor bubbling up. The absurdity of a teenager weaponizing social media against her aunt who had quietly funded half her wardrobe over the years, and in that charged atmosphere, with Mom dozing fitfully behind the curtain in her room after we were allowed a brief visit, I decided to enact a revenge that was as clever as it was understated, excusing myself to the hallway vending area where I pulled out my own device and anonymously forwarded one of Taylor's more embarrassing stories. A viral family anecdote from last Thanksgiving where Sarah had accidentally live-streamed a heated argument with her ex over child support, complete with tears and thrown plates that had garnered unwanted attention from mutual acquaintances, to a local parenting forum Sarah frequented, framing it as a cautionary tale on co-parenting gone wrong without naming names, but including just enough identifiable details to make her sweat when it inevitably circled back. The post going live with a satisfying ping that I imagined echoing through her carefully curated online presence like a poorly aimed comeback. Sarah noticed my subtle smile when I returned and pressed for what I was up to, but I deflected with a light-hearted quip about how some secrets are better aired out in the open air of the hospital corridor, dropping a casual hint about the old family trust from Dad's estate that I had mentioned in passing before, the one Mom always dismissed as insignificant, but which I knew held more leverage than she realized. A clue that made Taylor's eyes narrow in suspicion as she whispered to Sarah about how I always seemed one step ahead, playing the game with cards they didn't even know existed. Dawn crept in slowly the next morning, bringing with it the discharge papers for Mom, who emerged grumpy and weakened, but insistent on heading home rather than staying for further tests. Her complaints about the hospital food and the uncomfortable bed masking the deeper fatigue from the ordeal, and as we piled into a rideshare, me covering the fare again with a resigned swipe of my card since their options were limited without the SUV. The atmosphere in the back seat thickened with unresolved tension, Sarah shooting me occasional glares that spoke of brewing plans while Taylor scrolled silently, perhaps already regretting her digital confessions. Back at Mom's house by mid-morning, the group dynamic shifted into a makeshift family council around her kitchen table cluttered with pill bottles and half-eaten toast, where Sarah finally voiced her threat of legal action against me for interfering with her finances, her words delivered with a steely determination that surprised even Mom, who perked up from her chair, but as she reached for her phone to look up attorneys, I felt a quiet confidence settle in because, unbeknownst to them, I had been recording our conversations on a discreet app for months now, capturing every plea and promise in crystal clarity, a hidden ace that ensured whatever came next would unfold on terms far more favorable to me than they could imagine, leaving the air humming with the promise of escalating confrontations that might finally force the truth of our tangled dependencies into the light. The so-called family meeting convened at Mom's house that very afternoon under a sky heavy with the threat of rain, transforming her cozy but cluttered living room in the modest ranch-style home on the outskirts of Columbus into an impromptu arena for airing grievances that had festered like untreated wounds over the course of our shared history, with sunlight filtering weakly through the lace curtains and casting patterned shadows on the worn carpet where we all gathered around the mismatched furniture that held memories of better days, Sarah taking charge by slamming the collections agency envelope down on the coffee table like a gavel calling court to order, her eyes flashing with a determination fueled by desperation as she outlined the cascading effects of the credit freeze that had not only halted her daily transactions, but triggered a domino effect of late fees and service disruptions, from the cable bill that went unpaid to the automatic withdrawal for Taylor's school activities that bounced and incurred overdraft charges, painting a picture of financial freefall that she attributed entirely to my interference without acknowledging the role her own spending habits had played in digging the hole deeper. Taylor, sprawled on the end of the couch with her legs tucked under her and a scowl that deepened every time Sarah mentioned the SUV, chimed in sporadically with complaints about how the lack of transportation had already cost her a weekend hangout with friends and threatened her budding social life, while Mom, still pale and propped up in her recliner with a blanket over her lap, despite the doctor's advice to rest, nodded along sympathetically, her occasional interjections defending Sarah as the one who had always tried hardest in the family despite the odds stacked against her, a narrative that conveniently overlooked the countless times I had stepped in as the silent enabler to prevent total collapse. As the accusations flew thick and fast, with Sarah rising to her feet and gesturing emphatically about consulting a lawyer to challenge my access to the joint accounts and potentially sue for emotional distress caused by the repo and the hospital scare, the atmosphere thickened into something almost theatrical, the kind of scene that could have been ripped from one of those daytime talk shows where families air their dirtiest laundry for a shot at resolution, but here there was no mediator. Just the raw push and pull of loyalties and betrayals that made my stomach churn with a mix of vindication and creeping doubt about whether this path of calculated retribution was truly empowering me or simply mirroring the pettiness I had always accused them of embodying. The humorous mishap that punctured the tension arrived courtesy of Taylor, who in her agitation snatched up Mom's ancient cordless phone from the side table to text a friend for moral support, only to accidentally activate the speed dial instead, connecting live to our long-forgotten great-aunt Edna in Florida, whose voice crackled through the speaker with a cheerful but oblivious ramble about her latest bingo winnings and recipes for Jell-O salads. The absurdity of the interruption drawing involuntary snickers from all of us, even Sarah, who paused mid-sentence to disconnect the call. The brief levity serving as a stark reminder of how absurd our squabbles must appear from the outside, while simultaneously forcing me to confront the dilemma gnawing at me internally, wondering if continuing down this road of witty exposures and financial tweaks was healing the old wounds or just inflicting new ones that might scar us all irreparably. Especially as Mom's weary eyes met mine across the room with a flicker of something like disappointment that hit harder than any shouted insult. Seizing the momentary thaw, I steered the conversation toward a more constructive vein by suggesting we review the full scope of Sarah's debts together, pulling out a printed summary I had prepared earlier from public records and my own advisory tools. Laying it out on the table like a map of the minefield she had navigated so carelessly, the numbers stark and unforgiving in black ink that detailed everything from the maxed-out store cards for Taylor's wardrobe to the lingering medical bills from her divorce era, prompting Sarah to sink back into her chair with a defeated sigh as the reality of her predicament crystallized beyond the blame game. My revenge in that moment took shape through a seamless act of anonymity, having prearranged an alert system with a consumer protection watchdog group that monitored public debt filings, which I subtly triggered by confirming a flagged report on Sarah's profile earlier that week, resulting in an email notification pinging on her phone right then and there during our discussion, the subject line boldly proclaiming urgent, public debt exposure risk, and outlining how her unsecured loans could appear in background checks for job applications or even community events if not addressed. The content crafted to sound official and impartial, but hitting her with the precise pressure needed to underscore the consequences of her actions without my fingerprints anywhere near it, watching as her face drained of color while she scrolled through the details, a witty escalation that satisfied the itch for justice, but also amplified the growing conflict as Taylor leaned over to read and gasped at the implications for their shared credit future. The meeting dragged on into the early evening with half-hearted attempts at compromise, Sarah agreeing reluctantly to a payment plan I sketched out on a notepad while Mom dozed off intermittently, her snores punctuating the uneasy truce. But the true cliffhanger materialized when the doorbell rang unexpectedly around 6, the mail carrier thrusting a thick manila envelope through the slot with a hurried nod before vanishing into the dusk, the return address from our late father's estate. Attorney catching Sarah's eye as she retrieved it, her hands trembling slightly as she tore it open in front of us all to reveal a cover letter hinting at an unclaimed inheritance far larger than any of us had anticipated. Funds that had accrued quietly over the years through investments tied to a decision I had made in the wake of Dad's passing to redirect portions away from immediate family access in order to protect them from hasty dissipation. The document's language laced with legalese that promised revelations about distribution clauses dependent on past choices, leaving Sarah to whirl on me with a gaze that blended accusation and desperate hope, demanding to know exactly what role I had played in shielding or sabotaging Dad's legacy and why this bombshell was surfacing now amid our spiraling discord. The uncertainty of what the full contents might unveil hanging over us like the storm finally breaking outside, thunder rumbling in the distance as I met her stare with a measured calm that concealed the turmoil within, bracing for the final unraveling that this letter might precipitate. The lawyer's office downtown the following morning carried an air of contrived formality that clashed with the raw undercurrents of our family drama. The polished mahogany desk and shelves lined with leather-bound volumes serving as a neutral ground where the weight of Dad's legacy finally collided with the resentments we had all nurtured in varying degrees over the 15 years since his sudden passing from that heart attack while mowing the lawn on a sweltering July afternoon, a loss that had scattered us further rather than drawing us closer, leaving me to pick up the pieces in ways that blurred the lines between protector and puppeteer. Mr. Hargrove, the estate attorney with his wire-rimmed glasses and a voice as dry as the documents he shuffled before us, wasted no time diving into the envelope's contents once we had all settled into the stiff visitor chairs arranged in a semicircle. Sarah on one end clutching a notepad as if ready for battle, Taylor fidgeting beside her with half-hearted interest masked by her phone screen, Mom in the middle dozing lightly under the influence of her morning meds, and me positioned last. My posture straight, but my mind a whirlwind of anticipation for how this revelation might either mend or shatter the fragile threads holding us together after the whirlwind of the past few days. He explained methodically how the inheritance, originally a modest sum from Dad's life insurance and savings, had ballooned to well over $200,000 through conservative investments I had overseen as the designated trustee, a role I had accepted quietly at the reading of the will to ensure the funds weren't squandered on the immediate whims that had plagued Mom's decisions in the past, like the ill-fated remodels and loans to shady relatives that left our childhood home perpetually on the brink of foreclosure. And as his words painted the picture of prudent growth versus impulsive depletion, Sarah's face cycled through expressions of shock, greed, and simmering fury, her questions firing rapidly about why I hadn't disclosed this sooner or distributed it evenly from the start, oblivious to the codicil Dad had embedded that required demonstrations of financial responsibility before full access. A safeguard he had confided in me alone during one of his late-night talks about fearing the family patterns repeating after his own father's bankruptcy. The meeting escalated into a torrent of emotions that Hargrove tried vainly to moderate with his gavel-like pen taps, Sarah accusing me of hoarding what rightfully belonged to her as the one who had stayed close to home and shouldered the caregiving for Mom in recent years, even though those shoulders often meant delegating the heavy lifting to me financially while she pursued her sporadic career in graphic design that yielded more excuses than income, while Taylor interjected with wide-eyed calculations about how the money could replace her SUV and fund college applications without the stigma of debt hanging over her future, her youthful optimism clashing painfully with the reality that entitlement alone wouldn't unlock the vault. Mom stirred awake midway through, her confusion giving way to a tearful recounting of how Dad had always worried about providing for us all without enabling the weaknesses he saw mirrored in his own youth, a sentiment that struck me like a gut punch, because it echoed the grudge I had carried silently since discovering how he had favored Sarah in small ways during our teens, slipping her extra allowance for clothes while chiding my thriftiness as mere stubbornness, a bias that fueled my determination to control the trust not out of spite, but from a deep-seated fear that without intervention, the cycle would devour us all. Yet in that fluorescent-lit room, as their pleas and blame washed over me, I found myself at a moral crossroads, questioning whether my long-held leverage had empowered me into a healthier detachment or twisted me into the very controller they accused me of being, the audience of their disappointment making me second-guess if the satisfaction of these revenges was worth the isolation it promised. Hargrove, sensing the impasse, proposed a compromise by suggesting we sign preliminary agreements to release portions of the funds contingent on joint counseling and budgeting sessions, but I countered with my final act of witty retribution, producing a simple ledger I had compiled over the years, its pages filled with itemized entries of every bailout and favor, from the $5,000 for Sarah's divorce lawyer to the $200 for Taylor's prom dress, and the monthly $300 to Mom's rent, not as a weapon but as a balanced accounting that deducted those sums from their shares before disbursement, framing it as Dad's spirit of fairness finally enforced, the numbers adding up to trim their windfalls without leaving them destitute. Watching Sarah's shoulders slump in reluctant acceptance as she scanned the totals, a bitter chuckle escaping her lips when she realized the dress incident from my birthday factored in as a symbolic $100 line item, the humor in its precision cutting through the tension like a well-timed punchline in a tense comedy routine. We left the office around noon under a clearing sky, the paperwork signed in a haze of exhausted handshakes and hollow promises of better communication, Sarah pulling me aside on the sidewalk to mutter that maybe this was the way-up call she needed. Her eyes searching mine for sincerity amid the ambiguity of whether forgiveness lurked beneath her words or if resentment would fester anew, while Taylor offered a tentative hug that felt more obligatory than heartfelt, and Mom, leaning on my arm for support, whispered a quiet thanks laced with unspoken questions about the daughter she barely recognized anymore. Driving home alone afterward, the interstate humming beneath my tires as the cityscape faded into familiar suburbs, I replayed the morning's upheavals with a smile that wavered between triumph and melancholy. The inheritance distributed, but the deeper fractures in our bonds left exposed and untended, leaving me to ponder in the quiet of my car whether this chapter marked a path toward genuine reconciliation where we might rebuild on equal footing or if it signaled my permanent step back into solitude, the kind of independence that shields but also isolates, and as the sun dipped lower casting long shadows across the road ahead, the uncertainty lingered like an unfinished sentence, inviting thoughts on what family truly demands and whether the price of justice ever truly balances the scales.